In 1942, a brilliant submarine engineer disappeared on a mission so secret, it was erased from history. 60 years later, his wrecked sub was found off the coast, a ghost ship silent at the bottom of the sea. He had promised the love of his life he would return. Instead, he vanished, his name wiped from every official record. When a team of explorers finally uncovered the impossible wreck, they thought they were bringing home a lost hero. But the Navy didn't celebrate the discovery. They tried to bury it all over again. Because hidden inside that twisted metal wasn't just a soldier, but a truth they had sworn would never surface. What was so dangerous about this man's final mission that it had to be hidden for over half a century? Subscribe. That way you help more people discover these phenomenal stories. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The air in the attic was thick with the ghosts of forgotten things. It smelled of dry, brittle paper, of cedar wood that had long since given up its scent, and of the faint, salty dampness that forever clung to the old house on the coast of Maine. For 3 days, Margaret Collins, a woman now in her early 50s with kind eyes and a quiet patience honed by years of teaching, had been methodically working her way through the archaeology of her mother's life. Each box was a sealed tomb of memory, filled with yellowed photographs, report cards from the 1950s, and the delicate, tissue-wrapped teacups that had been saved for occasions that never seemed to arrive. It was a heavy task, not in physical weight, but in the emotional toll of dismantling a life lived, of deciding which fragments were worth saving and which were to be released back into the dust. The late afternoon sun slanted through the single grimy window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes, each one a tiny spark in the solemn, quiet space. Maggie felt a familiar ache of grief, a quiet hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. It wasn't the sharp, piercing pain of the first few months after her mother's passing, but a gentler, more pervasive sorrow, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes a part of you. She was down to the last corner, a stack of cardboard boxes marked simply, keepsakes. These were the deepest layers of the excavation, the items her mother could never bring herself to part with, but had also hidden away from daily life. Inside the third box, beneath a bundle of her own childhood drawings and a heavy wool blanket riddled with moth holes, she found it. It wasn't a box, but a small, unassuming packet of letters, bound together with a pale blue ribbon that had faded to the color of a cloudy sky. The envelopes were brittle, the edges soft and worn from time. The handwriting on the front was an elegant, looping script, the ink a faded sepia. They were all addressed to a name she vaguely recognized from old family stories. Miss Eleanor Whitaker. That was her grandmother's sister, her great-aunt Eleanor, a woman spoken of only in hushed, mournful tones. A woman who, as the family legend went, had lost her fiancé in the war and never loved again. Maggie's fingers, dusty and tired, fumbled slightly as she worked the ribbon loose. The knot was stiff, having held its post for what must have been close to 80 years. Most of the envelopes were empty, their contents long lost or perhaps stored elsewhere. But one remained. It was sealed. The paper was thicker than the others, almost like official stationery, and the postmark was faint but legible, 1942. With a strange sense of reverence, as if she were disturbing a sacred place, Maggie carefully worked a fingernail under the flap. The old glue gave way with a soft, tearing whisper. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent attic. She unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The creases were deep and permanent, like wrinkles on a tired face. The letter was not long, and the same elegant hand filled the page. It began, "My dearest Eleanor," and the words that followed were a testament to a love that felt both intensely personal and timelessly familiar. He wrote of missing her, of counting the days until he could return, of a small pocket watch she had given him that he kept with him always. He described the cold, relentless gray of the Atlantic and how he would close his eyes and picture her standing on the shore, the Maine sun in her hair. It was a letter from a young man at war, a man holding on to the one bright thing in a world that had gone dark. The man's name was signed at the bottom, "All my love, forever, James Harrington." The name clicked into place. He was the one, the lost fiancé, A submarine engineer, her mother had once said. A brilliant mind, gone too soon. Maggie felt a pang of sorrow for this man she had never met, and for the great aunt whose life had been irrevocably shaped by his absence. She was about to fold the letter back up, to place it carefully back with the empty envelopes, when a final, short paragraph at the bottom caught her eye. It seemed almost like an afterthought, tucked away below his signature. P.S. It read, "Don't you worry if you don't hear from me for a bit longer than usual after this one. They've assigned me to a special run, a new kind of test voyage. It's not on any of the official logs, so you won't see it on the deployment schedules. Top secret, they say. Just know that I'm thinking of you, and I'll be home before the autumn leaves have all fallen. I promise." Maggie read the words again, and then a third time. A cold shiver, entirely unrelated to the attic's chill, traced its way down her spine. Not on any of the official logs. The phrase echoed in the quiet room. It was one thing to be lost in the line of duty, a casualty of a global conflict, a name etched onto a memorial wall. It was another thing entirely to be on a mission that, according to this faded letter, officially never happened. It suggested a man who hadn't just died, but had been erased. The story of James Harrington, the brave engineer lost at sea, suddenly felt incomplete, its edges frayed with questions. A quiet indignation began to smolder within her. This wasn't just a dusty piece of family history anymore. This was an injustice, sleeping in a cardboard box for decades. This man, James, had served his country, had loved her great aunt, had promised to come home, and when he didn't, it seemed no one was held accountable. His existence, his final mission, was swept under the rug of wartime secrecy. He became a ghost, not just in her family's memory, but in the annals of history itself. Maggie looked from the letter in her hand to the grimy attic window. Outside, the gray waves of the Atlantic crashed against the rocky Maine coastline, the same waves that had swallowed James Harrington and his secret all those years ago. For the first time, she felt a strange and profound connection to him, a sense of responsibility that reached across the 80 years separating them. The grief for her mother was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a fierce, quiet resolve. The sea had kept its secret for a long, long time, but as she folded the letter and placed it safely in her pocket, Margaret Collins knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was going to make it give that secret back. The attic was no longer just an ending. It had become a beginning. The hopeful energy that had sparked to life in the attic carried Maggie through the next week. Armed with a name, a date, and a cryptic postscript, she felt like she held the key to a locked room. Her first stop was the National Archives branch in Waltham, Massachusetts, a sterile, climate-controlled building that smelled of preservation chemicals and the quiet reverence of history. It was the polar opposite of her mother's attic. Here, memory was not a messy, sentimental accumulation, but a cataloged, indexed, and sanitized collection of facts. She spent 2 full days hunched over a microfilm reader, the whirring of the machine a monotonous soundtrack to her search. She scrolled through endless lists of naval personnel from 1942, her eyes straining against the glowing green text. She found him, of course. Harrington, James T. Engineer, 2nd class. His service record was there, a brief and unremarkable summary of a young man's career, enlistment date, basic training location, commendations for technical aptitude. It was all there, right up until a final entry, dated late in the autumn of that year. The entry was stark, devoid of any detail or emotion. Just 4 cold, clinical words typed onto a line. Presumed lost at sea. There was no mission number, no vessel name, no theater of operations. It was a bureaucratic dead end, a concrete wall where a path should have been. It was as if his story, his life, had simply stopped, not with an event, but with a clerical decision. She requested the physical file, and a thin manila folder was eventually brought to her desk. Inside, there was nothing more. No letters of condolence to the family, no after-action reports, no mention of the submarine he was assigned to. It was a file scrubbed clean of its own conclusion. The man from the letter, the one who wrote of love and promises, was a ghost in his own official record. Frustration began to curdle the edges of her optimism. She drove back to Maine, the sterile silence of the archive replaced by the rhythmic hush of the tires on the highway. The official channels had failed her, so she turned to the unofficial ones. The next morning, she walked into the small, wood-paneled room of the Oakhaven Historical Society, a place run on donations and the passion of a few dedicated volunteers. The air inside smelled of lemon, polish, and old books. Behind a large oak desk sat a man who looked as though he might be one of the exhibits himself. He was well into his 80s, with a shock of white hair and glasses thick enough to be paperweights. His name was Arthur Pembroke, and he had been the town's unofficial memory keeper for 50 years. Maggie explained her search, laying out the few facts she had. James Harrington, a submarine engineer, lost sometime in 1942, possibly on a secret mission out of the nearby naval base. Arthur listened patiently, his head tilted, his gaze distant as if he were scanning the card catalog of his own mind. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a handkerchief, and then looked at her. "Harrington," he murmured. The name, a soft echo in the quiet room. "I don't recall the name specifically. So many boys went away then. But I remember the whispers." Maggie leaned forward. "Whispers?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Oh yes," Arthur said, a flicker of something, intrigue, perhaps even old fear, in his eyes. "This whole coast was a hive of activity during the war. Top secret stuff. The naval base wasn't just for repairs and deployment. They were building things there. New things. Experimental things. Things people weren't supposed to talk about." He lowered his voice. "There were rumors of a special project, a new kind of submarine. Faster, quieter. A ghost sub, some of the old fishermen called it. They'd see strange shapes on the water at night, hear engines when no ships were scheduled to be out. But if you asked an official, they'd look at you like you were crazy. It was all just fog. War jitters, they'd say." He paused, looking directly at Maggie. "A secret test voyage, you said? That fits. It fits the whispers perfectly. If a man was on a boat like that, and something went wrong, well, they wouldn't want a record of it, would they? It's easier to let a man disappear than to admit a secret weapon failed." Arthur's words, though based on nothing more than decades-old gossip, felt more real to Maggie than the official file at the archives. This was a truth that lived in the memory of the community, a story passed down in hushed tones, too persistent to be a complete fabrication. A spark of hope returned. Maybe she couldn't find an official document, but she could piece together a human story. She could prove his existence, his sacrifice. She could get his name etched onto the town's war memorial, a place it rightfully belonged. This became her new, more modest goal. Not to uncover a conspiracy, but simply to restore a man's honor. Feeling emboldened, she decided to try the official channels one last time. From her mother's kitchen, with the gray Atlantic visible out the window, she found the number for the Naval History and Heritage Command. After navigating a labyrinth of automated menus, she was finally connected to a real person, a man with a tired, professionally patient voice. Maggie carefully explained her situation, giving him James Harrington's name and service number. She mentioned the letter, the missing mission details, the whispers from the town. She could hear the man typing on a keyboard as she spoke. There was a long pause. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from procedural to faintly patronizing. "I can see the file here. The designation is clear. Presumed lost at sea." That was a standard determination during the war for personnel who were unaccounted for following an engagement or operational loss. Maggie's grip on the phone tightened. But what was the operational loss? What was the name of his submarine? Where did it happen? Another pause. "That information is not in the file available to me. Ma'am, you have to understand. It was 1942. Record-keeping was chaotic. We were fighting a world war. There are thousands of such cases, brave men and women whose final moments were never documented." Maggie felt a surge of anger. "This isn't just a case," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This was a person, a man who was promised his service would be remembered. He was on a secret test voyage." The man on the other end of the line sighed, a sound of weary dismissal that traveled hundreds of miles through the wire. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now taking on the gentle, condescending tone one might use with a confused child. With all due respect, family stories get embellished over the years. Secret missions, classified experiments, they make for a better story. But the truth is often much simpler and much sadder. Sometimes people just don't come home. And with that, the conversation was over. He offered his condolences for her family's loss and wished her a good day. Maggie hung up the phone, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. She stood motionless in the kitchen, staring out at the vast, indifferent ocean. The man's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes, people just don't come home. It was meant to be an endpoint, a compassionate but firm closing of a door. But for Maggie, it was a spark hitting gasoline. In that moment, her quest transformed. This was no longer just about curiosity, or even about family history. It wasn't just about getting a name on a memorial. It was about the cold, arrogant power of an institution to erase a human being. They had taken James Harrington's life, and then they had taken his story, hiding their failures and their secrets behind a wall of bureaucratic silence. They had left her great-aunt to stare at the ocean for 50 years, waiting for a man they had already forgotten. The official record wasn't just incomplete. It felt like a deliberate lie, an act of profound disrespect not only to James but to everyone who had ever loved him. The fight was no longer about the past. It was about the present. It was a fight against the idea that a person could be deemed expendable, their memory an inconvenience. It was a fight for a simple, fundamental truth, that every life matters and every story deserves to be told. The man on the phone was wrong. People don't just vanish. They are made to vanish. And Maggie Collins, standing in her late mother's quiet kitchen, decided she would not let them get away with it. The dismissive tone of the man from the Navy had an effect Maggie hadn't anticipated. It didn't discourage her. It hardened her. The polite, bureaucratic wall she had run into wasn't a dead end. It was a redirection. The official story was a fiction, a neatly typed lie in a manila folder. The truth, she now understood, didn't live in archives or on microfilm. It lived in people. It survived in the quiet, unwritten histories of families, passed down not in reports, but in the silences at the dinner table, in the stories that were never quite told. Her great-aunt Eleanor had been the epicenter of this silence. She was gone now, had been for nearly 20 years. But the grief she carried was a legacy, a living thing that had been passed on. And legacies, Maggie knew, have heirs. She spent an afternoon on the phone, calling distant cousins, people she hadn't spoken to in years, piecing together the frayed branches of her family tree. It was Eleanor's daughter she was looking for, a child born years after the war, a living link to the woman who had waited. After a series of conversations filled with long pauses and half-remembered facts, she found her. A woman named Clara Mayhew, living in a small fishing town 2 hours down the coast. The next morning, Maggie drove south, the gray coastline a constant, brooding presence to her left. The sky was the color of slate, and the sea churned restlessly, its surface choppy and white-capped. It felt like the ocean was in a foul mood, guarding its secrets with a cold, aggressive indifference. She found the address on a quiet street of small, salt-weathered cottages, each with a garden fighting a brave but losing battle against the salty air. Clara's house was neat and painted a pale, sea-washed blue, with a widow's walk on the roof that seemed to stare perpetually out at the water. When the door opened, Maggie was greeted by a woman in her late 70s, with her mother's kind, knowing eyes and a face etched with the fine lines of a life lived by the sea. There was a gentle, almost fragile air about her, but also a deep, quiet strength. She led Maggie into a living room filled with light, where every surface seemed to hold a memory. There were framed photographs, delicate pieces of embroidery under glass, and a collection of smooth, sea-worn stones on the mantelpiece. Clara listened with a polite, guarded stillness as Maggie explained her search, starting with the discovery in the attic and ending with the cold dismissal from the Navy. She laid James's letter out on the coffee table between them, a fragile, 80-year-old testament to a love that had been cut short. When Maggie finished, Clara was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the letter. "My mother never spoke his name," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "Not to me, not to anyone. It was a place inside her that was locked away. But his presence was everywhere. It was in the way she'd stop what she was doing and just stare out at the water. It was in the books of poetry she kept, with passages underlined about sailors and the sea. She looked up at Maggie, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She never remarried. People thought it was because she was heartbroken, a tragic figure. But it wasn't tragedy. It was loyalty. She made a promise to a young man, and in her heart, that promise never ended. Clara stood and walked to the window, her back to Maggie as she looked out at the churning gray waves. Every evening, without fail, she would walk down to the shore. Every single evening, from the day she received the telegram until the week she passed away. Rain, snow, summer sun, it didn't matter. She would stand there at the edge of the water, her hands clasped, and she would whisper. I used to ask her what she was saying when I was a little girl. She told me she was saying her prayers, but I knew they were for him. She was talking to him. She didn't believe he was gone. Not really. She believed the sea was just holding him. And she always said that one day, the sea would give him back. The image was so powerful, so filled with a lifetime of quiet devotion, that Maggie felt a lump form in her throat. This was the human cost of that cold, bureaucratic file. It wasn't just a missing record. It was a woman's entire life, shaped into a vigil of unending hope. This was the truth the Navy had tried to erase. Clara turned from the window. They sent her a letter, you know. The Navy. A few lines on a piece of official paper. Regret to inform you. Lost in the line of duty. She folded it once and put it away. She never looked at it again. She said to me, they don't know where he is, so how can they know that he's gone? After a moment, Clara walked to a small, dark wood chest in the corner of the room and lifted the lid. She rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a small, velvet-lined box. She brought it over to the coffee table and opened it. Nestled inside on the faded black velvet was a silver pocket watch. It was heavy, its casing worn smooth and featureless in places from years of being held. It wasn't ticking. Its time had stopped long ago. This was his, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the last thing he gave her to hold on to before he left for his final assignment. She kept it with her always. She would hold it in her hands when she stood on the shore. She carefully lifted the watch from the box and turned it over. With a delicate touch, she pointed to a small, intricate engraving on the back. Maggie leaned in to see. Etched into the silver were two sets of initials, J.H.E.W., entwined in a lover's knot. Beneath them, in a tiny, perfect script, was a verse. Maggie had to squint to read it. Romans 5:4. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Hope. It was the one thing the official record had tried to extinguish, and the one thing Eleanor had refused to surrender. The small, silent object in Clara's hand felt heavier than lead. It was an artifact not of time, but of timeless devotion. It was the anchor of a woman's entire existence, the physical proof of a love that a world war and a government cover-up could not destroy. Clara gently pressed the watch into Maggie's palm. Its cool, smooth weight was a shock. My mother always believed someone would come looking for the truth one day, she said, her fingers closing over Maggie's for a second. I think she would want you to have this. It belongs with the search. It belongs with him. Maggie looked down at the watch, its silver face reflecting the gray light from the window. She felt a profound and sudden weight of responsibility settle over her. This was no longer just a quest for historical justice. She was now the custodian of a sacred trust, the inheritor of an 80-year vigil. This watch was the heart of the story, a story of two people torn apart by secrets and a woman who stared down the ocean itself, refusing to believe that love could simply be lost at sea. As she drove home, the watch resting on the passenger seat beside her, the ocean to her left no longer looked menacing. It looked like a keeper of promises, a vast and patient witness. The mystery had a face now, and a name, and in her hand, Maggie held its heartbeat. Holding James Harrington's pocket watch felt like holding a compass whose needle was broken, pointing not north, but into the past. Maggie knew she had gathered all the human testimony she could. The whispers, the memories, the enduring grief, they formed the soul of the story. But she still lacked its body. She needed proof, something tangible that the men in their sterile offices couldn't dismiss as family folklore. She needed to find the submarine. The idea was absurd, like trying to find a specific needle in a continent-sized haystack made of water. She had no coordinates, no vessel name, only a vague hint of a secret test voyage somewhere off the Atlantic coast. It was an impossible task for a retired schoolteacher. So she began searching not for the sub, but for someone who knew how to look. Her research, now focused on maritime archaeology and naval history, led her to a name that appeared again and again in online forums and academic papers: Dr. Robert Hale. He was a retired naval engineer, a man who had spent 30 years designing the very machines that prowled the ocean depths. Now, in his retirement, he dedicated his time to finding and documenting their forgotten predecessors, the wrecks that littered the seabed like fallen monuments. He lived just a few towns over, a happy coincidence that felt like a nudge from fate. She found his number and called, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She expected an assistant, or perhaps a gruff dismissal, but the man who answered had a voice that was calm, steady, and deeply curious. She explained her story, trying not to sound like a rambling woman obsessed with a family myth. She told him about the letter, the blank service record, the town's whispers of a ghost sub. To her surprise, he didn't interrupt. He just listened. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. "A ghost sub," he finally said, his voice laced with a dry, academic intrigue. "You know, that old rumor has been floating around this coast for decades. Most serious people dismiss it, but I've seen things." Maggie held her breath. "Seen things? What things?" He chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Sonar anomalies. Every few years, someone doing a survey for a new underwater cable or a geological study will ping something out there. A shape on the seafloor that doesn't match the charts. It's usually in the same general area, a deep trench about 20 miles offshore. The official explanation is always the same. It's a unique rock formation, a trick of the sonar. But the dimensions, they're not quite right for a rock." He paused again, and Maggie could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. "James Harrington, you said, 1942? An experimental boat? It all fits a certain pattern." The Navy was doing a lot of things back then they didn't want the Germans or the American public to know about, rushing new designs into service before they were ready. If one of them failed catastrophically on a test run, well, it's much cleaner to let it disappear than to admit your new wonder weapon is a death trap. They met the next day at a diner halfway between their towns. Dr. Hale was in his early 70s, a man with a weathered face, a sharp, intelligent gaze, and the calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working with metal and machinery. He was pragmatic and methodical, a man of science. But beneath the gruff exterior, Maggie sensed a deep respect for the stories the ocean held. She showed him the letter and the pocket watch. He examined the watch with an engineer's eye, his thumb tracing the worn engraving. "Endurance produces character," he read aloud, his voice quiet. "A sailor's verse, if I ever heard one." He looked at Maggie, his expression serious. "This is more than a rumor, isn't it? For you, this is personal." Maggie nodded. "It's about a promise, and a truth that's been denied for too long." That seemed to be the key for Dr. Hale. He, too, had a healthy distrust of the official narrative, born from decades of battling military bureaucracy. He agreed to help. He had access to a research vessel, a sturdy, repurposed fishing trawler named the Veritas, Latin for truth, outfitted with modern side-scan sonar equipment. It would be expensive, he warned. Fuel, equipment rental, a small crew. But Maggie didn't hesitate. She had inherited some money from her mother, and she couldn't imagine a better use for it than this. It took 2 weeks to arrange the expedition. The weather was a constant, fickle variable. They needed a calm sea, a window of at least 2 days to methodically scan the area where the sonar anomalies had been reported. The sense of anticipation was electric. Maggie felt a cautious, rising optimism. The first real hope she'd had that this wasn't just a search for a story, but for a physical place. Finally, the forecast gave them their window. They set out from the harbor at dawn, the sky a pale, promising pink. The sea was calm, the water like dark glass. Maggie stood on the deck of the Veritas, the salty spray on her face, James's pocket watch heavy and cool in her pocket. It felt like she was bringing him with her, a silent passenger on a journey home. For the first day, the work was slow and repetitive. They moved back and forth in a meticulous grid pattern, a process Dr. Hale called mowing the lawn. The sonar array, towed behind the boat, sent back a constant stream of data, painting a picture of the unseen world 100 feet below. On the screen in the cabin, the seafloor scrolled by, a monochrome landscape of sand, rock, and silt. It was hypnotic, and after hours of staring, Maggie's eyes began to ache. By late afternoon, they had found nothing but rocks and the rusted hulk of a modern fishing trawler. The initial optimism began to fade, replaced by the familiar gnawing doubt. What if the anomalies really were just rocks? What if the ghost sub was just a fisherman's tale? Then, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long, golden path across the water, the weather turned. It came on suddenly, a dark line of clouds appearing on the western horizon, moving toward them with an unnatural speed. The wind picked up, whipping the calm surface of the sea into a frenzy of whitecaps. The captain, a stoic man named Gus, with a face like a nautical chart, came into the cabin. "Storm's blowing in," he said, his voice grim. "A bad one. We need to head in. Now." Dr. Hale argued, pointing to the sonar screen. "Just one more pass, Gus. We're right over the target area." But the boat was already beginning to pitch and roll violently. A wave crashed over the bow, sending a sheet of icy water across the deck. Maggie felt a lurch of fear in her stomach. The boat, which had felt so sturdy and reliable just an hour before, now seemed like a fragile toy in the grip of a powerful, angry force. The sky grew dark, the color of a deep bruise. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in hard, driving sheets that blurred the world into a gray chaos. The waves grew into monstrous, rolling hills of water that lifted the boat up and slammed it back down with bone-jarring force. Inside the cabin, equipment slid across countertops, and the sonar screen flickered. Maggie gripped the edge of a table to keep her balance, her knuckles white. It felt personal. It felt as if the sea itself had woken up and was furiously trying to push them away, to protect the secret it had kept for so long. Gus wrestled with the wheel, his face set in a grim mask of concentration, turning the boat back toward the distant, unseen shore. The journey back was a terrifying ordeal that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Every wave threatened to capsize them. Twice, the stern was swamped, and the crew had to scramble to secure loose gear. Maggie huddled in the cabin, her earlier hope replaced by a primal fear. She was no longer a historical detective. She was just a person, small and vulnerable, at the mercy of an element she could not control. When they finally limped back into the relative calm of the harbor hours later, battered and soaked, a profound sense of defeat settled over her. The storm had not just been a physical obstacle. It felt like a warning. She had trespassed, had tried to force open a door that was meant to stay locked. As she stood on the swaying dock, the rain still lashing down, she looked out into the black, churning chaos of the sea. This was more than just a search for a wreck. It was a confrontation. The sea had kept James Harrington for 80 years, and it was clear now that it had no intention of letting him go without a fight. The mission had a new dimension of risk, a physical danger that mirrored the emotional weight of her quest. The truth wasn't just buried, it was guarded. The violence of the storm left an imprint on Maggie, a deep-seated respect for the power she was confronting. For 2 weeks, the Atlantic heaved and churned under a sky, the color of old pewter. Low-pressure systems stalled off the coast, bringing relentless wind and rain. The sea was angry, and the waiting was a form of slow torture. Every morning, Maggie would walk down to the shore, the wind whipping her hair, and stare out at the gray, chaotic water. She clutched James's watch in her pocket, its smooth, cold weight, a constant reminder of her purpose. She thought of Eleanor, standing on a similar shore for a lifetime, her vigil unwavering. Maggie had only been at this for a few weeks, and already the weight of the quest felt immense. The fear from that night on the boat had subsided, replaced by a stubborn, quiet resolve. The storm hadn't broken her spirit. It had forged it into something harder. She wasn't just curious anymore. She felt like a soldier in a long, quiet war against silence and forgetting. Dr. Hale called every few days with weather updates, his voice a calm, reassuring presence against the howling wind. He was undeterred. The storm, he explained with scientific detachment, was just a meteorological event. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that they had disturbed something, a long, deep sleep, and the ocean was fighting to keep its secrets buried. Finally, the weather broke. The angry gray skies gave way to a brilliant, crystalline blue. The wind died down, and the sea, as if exhausted by its own fury, settled into a gentle, rhythmic swell. It was the window they had been waiting for. They set out again at dawn, the mood on the Veritas more sober, more focused than before. There was less chatter, a shared understanding that this was not an adventure, but a serious and potentially dangerous undertaking. They returned to the search grid, to the exact coordinates where the storm had driven them back. The sonar was deployed once more, its electronic pulse, a steady, hopeful heartbeat sent down into the depths. The seafloor scrolled across the monitor in the cabin, a familiar landscape of sand and rock. Hours passed. The sun climbed high into the sky, its warmth a welcome change from the weeks of cold damp. Maggie sat in the cabin, her eyes glued to the screen, a thermos of coffee growing cold beside her. She felt a strange mixture of intense focus and profound fatigue. The search felt endless, the ocean vast and empty. And then, it happened. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic discovery. It was a subtle shift on the screen, a shape that began to emerge from the monochrome landscape of the seabed. It was long, impossibly straight, and unnaturally symmetrical. It wasn't a rock. Dr. Hale, who had been quietly observing over her shoulder, leaned in closer, his voice a low, excited whisper. "That's it. Gus, hold our position. Right here." The image on the screen slowly resolved as the boat passed directly over the target. There, half buried in the sand and silt of the ocean floor, was the unmistakable outline of a submarine. It was lying on its side, a great, dark shape resting in the silent gloom. It looked ancient, eternal, like a fossil of some great sea creature that had laid down to die centuries ago. The atmosphere in the cabin changed in an instant. The quiet focus erupted into a flurry of controlled, professional excitement. Dr. Hale was already on the radio, coordinating with the crew on deck to deploy the ROV, the remote-operated vehicle. It was a small, unmanned submersible, a bright yellow box of technology equipped with high-intensity lights and a powerful camera, their eyes in the deep. Maggie felt her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. She watched on a separate monitor as the ROV began its slow descent, a small, brave explorer venturing into another world. The water on the screen shifted from light blue to a deep, inky black as it went deeper. The only light was from the ROV's own powerful beams, cutting two perfect cones through the darkness. The depth gauge ticked downward, 50 feet, 75, 100. And then the sandy bottom appeared, illuminated in the stark, artificial light. The ROV moved forward, its thrusters stirring up small clouds of silt, and out of the gloom, the wreck emerged. It was breathtaking and terrifying all at once. The submarine was larger than it had appeared on the sonar, a silent, sleeping giant. Its steel hull was covered in decades of marine growth, but its shape was undeniable. It was a World War II-era boat, but the design was wrong, subtly different from the standard fleet submarines of the time. The conning tower was sleeker, more streamlined. Dr. Hale pointed to the screen, his voice filled with a kind of reverent awe. "Look at that. The fairwater planes are retractable. And the hull shaping, it's an experimental design. I've only ever seen it in declassified schematics from 1941. This is her. This is the ghost sub." The ROV began a slow, careful circumnavigation of the wreck. The camera panned across the hull, revealing a long, jagged tear in its side, a catastrophic wound that spoke of a sudden, violent end. This was not a boat that had been scuttled. This was a tomb. As the ROV moved toward the forward section, Maggie felt a knot of dread and anticipation tighten in her stomach. She was looking for one thing, one small piece of proof that would connect this silent wreck to the man in the letter. The ROV's mechanical arm, a delicate and precise instrument, reached out and began to gently brush away the accumulated silt from a forward hatch that had been blown open by the pressure. The light from the camera pierced the darkness inside. The interior was a chaotic mess of twisted metal and debris, a place of unimaginable violence frozen in time. The camera moved slowly, panning across the wreckage, and then it stopped. The light focused on a small object lying on the floor of the flooded compartment, half covered in mud. It was a wrench, a heavy, industrial tool, common on any submarine. But as the camera zoomed in, Maggie gasped. Etched into the steel handle, darkened by time but still perfectly legible, were two initials, J.H. James Harrington. He had been here. It was a moment of profound, dizzying contradiction. A wave of triumphant joy crashed against an even greater wave of sorrow. He was found. The proof was undeniable, but he was also gone, lost in this cold, dark place for 60 years. The whispers were real. The letter was true. The Navy had lied. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving behind a deep, aching sense of grief. It was a grief not just for James, but for Eleanor, for the generations of her family who had lived with this unanswered question. The truth was finally here, illuminated in the cold, unforgiving light of a camera, 100 feet beneath the waves. But as she stared at the screen, at the silent, broken tomb, a new and unsettling question began to form in her mind. Finding the wreck was one thing, but what did she do now? Did this discovery bring peace, or did it just open a deeper, more painful wound? The sea had given back its secret, but Maggie suddenly felt the immense, crushing weight of it. Should this truth, which had cost so much to find, stay here in the silent deep, or should it be brought to the surface, into a world that had tried so hard to forget it? The journey back to shore was a world away from the triumphant return Maggie had imagined. The elation of discovery was a fleeting, fragile thing, quickly overshadowed by the profound gravity of what they had found. The silent wreck on the ocean floor was not just an archaeological find, it was a gravesite. The video from the ROV played on a loop in her mind. The twisted metal, the deep, impenetrable gloom, the lonely wrench with its etched initials. She held the knowledge like a heavy, fragile object, unsure of what to do with it. Dr. Hale was methodical and professional. He compiled a detailed report, including the sonar scans, the ROV footage, and a thorough analysis of the submarine's unique design features, cross-referencing them with the declassified schematics he had found. The evidence was airtight, indisputable. He told Maggie the next step was clear. They had to present their findings to the Navy. "They have to acknowledge it now," he said, his voice firm with a conviction Maggie didn't entirely share. "This isn't a rumor anymore. It's a fact, sitting on the bottom of the ocean. They have protocols for this. Sunken military craft, MIAs. They will have to investigate, to honor these men." His confidence was reassuring, but a small, cold knot of doubt remained in Maggie's stomach. She remembered the dismissive voice on the phone, the impenetrable wall of bureaucracy. An institution that had kept a secret for 60 years was not likely to give it up easily. Still, it was the right and proper thing to do. It was the official channel, the path to the justice she had been seeking. A week later, after the report was finalized and notarized, she made the call. This time, she didn't call the General Inquiries line. Dr. Hale had a contact, a Rear Admiral at the Naval History and Heritage Command, a man he had dealt with in the past. It took days to secure an appointment, but finally, they were given a time to present their findings via a secure video conference. They sat in Dr. Amir Hale's study, surrounded by books on naval architecture and maritime history. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as the face of Rear Admiral Fletcher appeared on the screen. He was a man in his late 50s with a stern, impassive face and a row of ribbons on his immaculate uniform. He looked like a man who was not easily impressed. "Dr." Hale began the presentation, his voice calm and factual. He walked the Admiral through the data, the sonar images, the video evidence, the historical context of the experimental submarine program. Maggie watched the Admiral's face for any reaction, any flicker of surprise or interest. But there was nothing. His expression remained a carefully neutral mask. When Dr. Hale finished. He put the final piece of evidence on the screen. A clear, high-resolution still from the ROV footage, showing the wrench with James Harrington's initials. "Admiral," Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My great-aunt's fiancé, Engineer James Harrington, was on that submarine. We have his last letter, which describes this secret mission. This is his final resting place. His family, and the families of the other crewmen, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to have their loved ones officially recognized and honored." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. The Admiral steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on something beyond the camera. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, polite, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Ms. Collins, Dr. Hale, thank you for bringing this to our attention. The U.S. Navy takes all such claims very seriously. The information you have provided is compelling. We will take it under advisement and review our internal records." Dr. Hale leaned forward. "With all due respect, Admiral, this is more than a claim. We have provided you with the precise location and positive visual identification of a U.S. naval vessel. Standard protocol requires—" The Admiral cut him off, his voice still polite, but with an underlying edge of steel. "I am well aware of the protocols, Doctor. As I said, we will review the matter. You must understand, this involves highly sensitive historical records, some of which may still be subject to classification. This process takes time." "How much time?" Maggie asked, the cold knot in her stomach tightening. "That is impossible to say," the Admiral replied smoothly. "We appreciate your diligence. A representative from my office will be in touch with you if and when there are any updates. Thank you for your time." And with that, the screen went blank. Maggie and Dr. Hale sat in stunned silence. It hadn't been an outright denial, but it was something worse. It was a dismissal, wrapped in the polite, suffocating language of bureaucracy. They were being stonewalled. The days that followed turned into weeks. Maggie called the Admiral's office every few days. At first, she was put through to a junior officer who assured her the matter was under active review. Then, she was relegated to a secretary who informed her there was no new information at this time. Finally, her calls simply went to voicemail and were never returned. The pattern was agonizingly familiar. Authority was dismissing her. The truth was being buried, just as it had been in 1942. The elation of her discovery curdled into a bitter, helpless frustration. It felt as though she had brought James to the very brink of being found, only to have the door slammed in his face a second time. She felt powerless, as if she were a small boat pushing against a tidal wave of institutional indifference. She found herself walking the shoreline again, just as Eleanor had, staring out at the vast, gray expanse. She had the truth, but it was a truth no one in power wanted to hear. What good was knowing if the world refused to listen? One evening, as she was sitting in her mother's kitchen, staring at the phone and feeling the familiar sting of defeat, Dr. Hale called. His voice was grim. "They're not going to do anything, Maggie," he said, without preamble. "I spoke to an old friend of mine, someone still on the inside. He made some discreet inquiries. The official position is that our wreck is a previously uncharted geological formation. They're classifying the area as an underwater hazard to keep civilian boats away. They're burying it, literally and figuratively." The news landed like a physical blow. A geological formation. It was a lie so brazen, so insulting, that Maggie was momentarily speechless. They were actively trying to erase the wreck, to write it off the map, just as they had written James Harrington out of the history books. All the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound sense of despair. "So that's it then," she said, her voice flat. "We lose. They win." "No," Dr. Hale said, and for the first time, she heard a spark of anger in his voice. "They don't win. Bureaucracies are powerful, Maggie, but they have a weakness. They hate the light. They thrive in the dark, in the silence. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when there are people brave enough to keep telling it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Don't quit now. This isn't the end of the fight. It's just the end of the first round." His words were a lifeline. The despair didn't vanish, but a tiny, defiant flame flickered back to life within her. He was right. They had been erased once by silence. She would not let it happen again. The fire of determination, which had been banked to a dull ember, began to glow once more. She didn't know how, but she knew her fight was not over. The Navy had drawn its line in the sand. Now, she would have to find a way to cross it. Dr. Hale's words echoed in Maggie's mind for days. Truth has a way of surfacing. But how? She had the physical evidence, the wreck, and the emotional evidence, the letter, the watch, the story of Eleanor's vigil. What she was missing was a human voice from the past, a witness. She had run into a wall of official denial, a wall built of classified documents and 60 years of institutional silence. She realized she couldn't knock the wall down from the outside. She needed someone who had been on the inside, someone who had helped build that wall and now, perhaps, regretted it. The thought seemed impossible. Anyone involved in a secret mission in 1942 would be in their 90s, if they were alive at all. Finding such a person would be a miracle. But Maggie had come too far to believe in dead ends. She began a new, painstaking line of research, shifting her focus away from the submarine and onto the men who would have supported it. She started with the naval base. Who was stationed there in the autumn of 1942? Specifically, who worked in communications? A secret test mission would have had a radio link to the shore, however brief. Someone had to have been listening. She spent weeks combing through digitized archives of base personnel rosters, a tedious and often fruitless task. The names were a blur of history, thousands of young men who had passed through this small coastal town on their way to war. Most of the records ended with a transfer to the Pacific, or a discharge in 1945. But a few listed a local address, men who had come to Maine for the war and decided to stay. She cross-referenced these names with public records, searching for obituaries, census data, anything that might point to a survivor. One name, Albert Finney, a radio operator, first class, caught her eye. His service record showed he had been stationed at the base communications center for the entirety of 1942 and had been discharged locally due to a medical issue in 1943. An online search brought up a recent article in a local newspaper about a 95th birthday celebration for an Albert Finney at the Acadia Point Veterans Home, just an hour's drive away. The photograph showed a frail-looking man in a wheelchair, surrounded by nurses, a faint, sad smile on his face. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a sliver of a possibility. But it was the only lead she had. The veteran's home was a quiet, orderly place that smelled of antiseptic and cooked vegetables. Maggie's heart pounded as she was led down a long, polished hallway to a sunroom at the back of the building. Albert Finney was sitting by a large window, a plaid blanket draped over his knees, his gaze fixed on the seagulls circling in the pale sky. He was thin, and his skin was like parchment, but his eyes, when he turned them toward her, were startlingly clear and lucid. They were eyes that had seen a great deal and remembered all of it. Maggie introduced herself carefully, explaining that she was a local historian researching the wartime activities at the naval base. She started with general questions, asking about his duties, the atmosphere on the base, the constant hum of secrecy. He answered in a soft, reedy voice, his memories of that time still sharp and vivid. He spoke of the long, tense nights in the radio room, the crackle of static, the coded messages that were a constant river of information flowing in and out. He was polite but distant, his answers brief and guarded. After 20 minutes of careful conversation, Maggie knew she had to take the risk. She leaned forward, her voice low. "Mr. Finney," she said, "I'm looking for information about a specific mission, an unofficial one, a test voyage of a new, experimental submarine in the late autumn of 1942. The change in him was immediate and profound. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight stiffening of his posture, a flicker in his clear blue eyes. The polite distance vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense stillness. He looked away from her, back out the window, but she knew he was no longer seeing the seagulls. He was seeing the past. "There were no experimental submarine tests that autumn," he said, his voice flat, the words sounding rehearsed, like a line he had been ordered to memorize 60 years ago. "Then what happened to James Harrington?" Maggie asked softly. At the mention of the name, Albert Finney flinched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was there. He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw the immense, crushing weight he was carrying behind his eyes. It was the look of a man who had been haunted for a lifetime. He was silent for a full minute, a minute that stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant cry of the gulls. Maggie held her breath, not daring to speak, knowing that this was the moment, that the entire quest had led her to this fragile old man in this quiet sunroom. "We were told to forget," he finally whispered, his voice raspy with disuse and old sorrow. They came into the radio room the next morning. 2 officers I'd never seen before. Stern-faced men from Washington. They took the logs, they took all the tapes, and they told us that the transmission we had heard the night before never happened, that the vessel in question had never left port, that if we ever spoke of it to anyone, we would be tried for treason. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly in his lap. I was 20 years old. I was terrified. We all were. So we did as we were told. We forgot. "What did you hear, Mr. Finney?" Maggie asked, her voice gentle. "What was in that last transmission?" He closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, it was as if he were reliving it. "It was chaos," he said. "The signal was weak, broken up by static. The operator was a young fellow, his voice high with panic. He was calling for help. He kept repeating their coordinates, shouting about a catastrophic hull breach. He said the ballast tanks were ruptured, that they were going down fast." Albert's own voice choked with emotion. And then another voice came on the line. Calmer, deeper. It was the engineer, I think. He took the radio. He said, "Tell them the stern planes are jammed. It's a design flaw. There's no control." He was trying to give them a technical report, even as his world was coming apart. He was a professional to the very end. A tear traced a path down Albert Finney's wrinkled cheek. His last words, before the signal went dead, he said, "Tell Eleanor I love her." And then, there was just static. The name hung in the air between them. Eleanor. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was it. This was the witness. The human voice that could break 60 years of silence. Maggie felt a wave of emotions so powerful it almost overwhelmed her. Grief for the terrified men in their sinking tomb, awe at James Harrington's courage, and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow for this old man who had carried their final moments as a secret burden for his entire life. "I've prayed for this day," Albert whispered, opening his eyes and looking directly at Maggie. "I've prayed that someone would find them. I was too much of a coward to break my orders, but I never forgot. Not for a single day." In that moment, 2 lives, separated by decades and experience, finally connected. The young man who had been ordered to keep silent and the woman who refused to stop seeking the truth, the guilt he had carried and the justice she had been searching for, met in that quiet sunroom. The secret was finally free. It was no longer his burden alone to bear. Albert Finney's confession was not an ending. It was a detonation. The secret he had carried for 60 years was now out. A living, breathing testimony that could no longer be ignored. Maggie left the veteran's home with a sense of profound clarity. The path forward was no longer shrouded in fog. Dr. Hale had been right. Bureaucracies thrived in the dark. It was time to turn on the lights. She knew that another formal appeal to the Navy would be met with the same wall of denial. They would discredit Albert, call him a confused old man, dismiss his testimony as the ramblings of a failing memory. She couldn't fight them on their turf, in the quiet, closed-door world of official channels. She had to take the fight somewhere else. She had to take it to the people. Her first call was to a reporter at the local newspaper, the Maine Coastal Chronicle, a young, ambitious journalist named Sarah Jenkins who had written the article about Albert's 95th birthday. Maggie laid out the entire story, from the letter in the attic to the discovery of the wreck, to the Navy's stonewalling, and finally, to the bombshell of Albert Finney's eyewitness account. Sarah listened, at first with professional skepticism, then with growing fascination, and finally, with the barely concealed excitement of a reporter who knows she has stumbled upon the story of a lifetime. Over the next week, they worked together. Sarah, with Maggie's guidance, began to track down the families of the other crewmen. It was a difficult task, 60 years after the fact, but not impossible. The unofficial whispers in the community had kept some of the names alive. An old fisherman remembered a buddy who had served on a submarine and never came back. A woman recalled her uncle, a young torpedoman who had been assigned to a special project at the base. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to assemble the ghosts of the lost crew. They found 4 other families, scattered across New England, who had stories almost identical to James Harrington's. A vague telegram from the Navy, no official details, no gravesite, just a lingering, unanswered question that had been passed down through generations. For these families, Maggie's call was a shock, a resurrection of a long-dormant grief, but also a profound validation. They weren't crazy. Their family stories weren't embellished myths. The men they had lost were real, and their sacrifice had been deliberately erased. As the pieces came together, Maggie realized she couldn't simply let the story be told in a newspaper. This was about more than just exposing a cover-up. It was about honor, about memory, and about bringing these men home, not in body, but in spirit. She decided to organize a memorial service. It wouldn't be official, not sanctioned by the Navy or any government body. It would be a memorial from the families. For the families, a public act of remembrance on the very shore where Eleanor had kept her lonely vigil. She chose a small, windswept bluff overlooking the ocean, a place where you could see for miles, where the sky and the sea met in a vast, unbroken line. She set a date, 2 weeks away, giving the families time to travel. The newspaper article ran the Sunday before the memorial. It was a front-page story, a stunning, detailed account of the entire saga, complete with pictures of James's letter, a sonar image of the wreck, and a poignant, recent photo of Albert Finney. The headline was simple and devastating. The Ghost Sub. 60 years of lies. A lifetime of waiting. The story hit the small coastal community like a thunderclap. It was all anyone talked about in the diners, in the post office, at the grocery store. The old whispers were now a public roar. The story was picked up by the Associated Press, and suddenly, the small town in Maine was at the center of a national news story. Maggie's phone began to ring off the hook. Calls from national news networks, from documentary filmmakers, from other families across the country who had lost loved ones in unexplained wartime incidents. The wall of silence the Navy had so carefully constructed for over half a century was beginning to crumble. The day of the memorial was clear and bright, but a cold, sharp wind blew in off the water, snapping at the small American flags that had been planted along the bluff. Maggie had expected a small gathering, just the families and a few interested locals, but when she arrived, she saw a crowd of over 200 people. There were veterans in their uniforms, their chests adorned with medals. There were fishermen, their faces weathered by the sun and sea. There were families with young children. An entire community had come to stand witness. The descendants of the lost crew stood together at the front, a small, solemn group united by a shared, long unspoken grief. Clara Mayhew was there, her hand clutching Maggie's, her eyes fixed on the endless expanse of the ocean. At the center of the gathering, in his wheelchair, wrapped in blankets against the cold, sat Albert Finney. He was frail, but his eyes were clear and steady. This was his moment of redemption, the act of courage he had waited a lifetime to perform. When it was his turn to speak, 2 young men from the local VFW post helped him to a small podium. His voice, aided by a microphone, was thin but carried on the wind, a voice from another time reaching across the decades. He didn't speak for long. He simply told the truth. He described the last, desperate transmission, the young man's panic, the engineer's calm professionalism, and he repeated James Harrington's final words, his voice cracking with an old, deep sorrow. "Tell Eleanor I love her." A profound, heart-wrenching silence fell over the crowd. In that moment, the story ceased to be about a historical cover-up and became an intensely human tragedy. Then, one by one, a representative from each of the 5 families came forward and spoke the name of their lost loved one, sharing a small memory, a faded photograph, a story passed down. These men were no longer just names on a forgotten roster. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fiancés. They had lives and hopes and people who had loved them. As the last name was spoken, a reporter from a national news network approached a man in a crisp uniform who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, observing the proceedings with a stoic, unreadable expression. He was a commander from the Public Affairs Office of the U.S. Navy, sent to monitor the situation. In front of the rolling cameras, the reporter asked him for a comment. The commander, clearly unprepared for a public confrontation, stammered for a moment. He repeated the official line about a geological formation and an ongoing review, but his words sounded hollow, absurd, in the face of the raw, undeniable human grief that surrounded him. The crowd began to murmur, a low, angry sound. The Navy's lie was dying, right there, on that windy bluff, in the full light of day. Justice, Maggie realized, wasn't something that was given by institutions. It was something that was claimed by people. This memorial was their claim. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse, Maggie walked over to a small, temporary plaque that had been placed at the edge of the bluff. It listed the names of the 5 crewmen they had identified. She took the silver pocket watch from her pocket, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. She had carried it with her for this entire journey. It had been her connection to James, to Eleanor, to the promise that had started it all. With a sense of quiet finality, she gently placed the watch on the base of the plaque. The ordinary object had completed its extraordinary journey. It was no longer just a keepsake of a lost love. It was a symbol of a truth that had endured, a promise that had, in its own way, finally been kept. The memorial on the bluff was not the end of the story, but the turning point. The public pressure, fueled by national media attention, became a relentless tide that the Navy's wall of silence could no longer hold back. The image of Albert Finney, a 95-year-old veteran confessing the truth, and the tearful faces of the descendants, played on evening news broadcasts across the country. The story of the ghost sub had a human face, and it was a face that America could not ignore. Within a month, the official story of a geological formation quietly disappeared. The Navy, facing a public relations nightmare and pressure from several congressional representatives who had been contacted by the families, issued a carefully worded press release. They announced that newly reviewed historical data had prompted them to re-evaluate the loss of a submarine during a classified wartime exercise in 1942. The statement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language, admitting no wrongdoing, acknowledging no cover-up, but buried within the jargon was the one thing Maggie had fought for. They confirmed the wreck. They acknowledged its existence and announced that the names of the crew, including James T. Harrington, would be officially added to the rolls of the honored dead. It wasn't an apology, but it was a surrender. It was the truth, finally entered into the official record. A few weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a small, official-looking package arrived at Maggie's house. Inside was a bronze plaque, heavy and official, bearing the Navy crest. It listed the names of the submarine's full crew, 12 men in all, 7 more than Maggie and Sarah had been able to identify. Their sacrifice, once erased, was now cast in metal. With it was a letter from the office of the Secretary of the Navy, expressing formal condolences to the families and inviting them to a dedication ceremony where the plaque would be permanently installed at the town's war memorial. Justice, when it finally arrived, was quiet and formal, delivered by mail. It lacked the fire and passion of the fight, but it was real. It was permanent. The day of the dedication was a stark contrast to the makeshift memorial on the bluff. The sky was a placid, cloudless blue, and the sea was calm, its surface glittering in the autumn sun. A full Navy honor guard was present, their uniforms crisp, their movements precise and solemn. A small crowd gathered, a mix of townspeople, veterans, and the families who had become inextricably linked by their shared history. Maggie stood with Clara Mayhew and Albert Finney, who was bundled into his wheelchair, a guest of honor. The 3 of them formed a small, unlikely trio. The keeper of the memory, the seeker of the truth, and the bearer of the secret. They had, in their own ways, carried this story through the long, dark decades. As a Navy chaplain spoke of sacrifice and duty, Maggie's gaze drifted from the polished honor guard to the vast, calm ocean beyond. The water, which had once seemed like an adversary, a monstrous, secretive entity, now looked different. It felt peaceful, like a guardian rather than a jailer. It had held its secret, yes, but it had also preserved it, keeping the silent tomb safe from the ravages of time until someone was ready to listen. The ceremony concluded with a rifle salute, the sharp crack of the guns echoing out over the water, followed by the lonely, mournful notes of a bugler playing taps. As the final note faded into the salty air, a sense of profound and quiet closure settled over the crowd. The fight was over. The names were restored. The story was told. After the ceremony, as the officials and the crowds began to disperse, the three of them made their way to the edge of the shore, away from the formalities. They stood there in silence for a long time, the gentle waves lapping at the sand just a few feet away. It was the same stretch of shore where Eleanor had stood for all those years. Clara, her eyes shining with tears, turned to Maggie. "My mother," she said, her voice a soft whisper that was almost carried away by the breeze. "She always said the sea would give him back one day. I used to think it was just a comforting story," she told herself. But she was right. Maggie looked at the calm, sunlit water. Clara's words resonated with a deep and simple truth. The sea had given him back. Not in the way a young woman in 1942 would have prayed for, but in the only way it could. It had given back his name, his honor, his story. It had given him back to history. Albert Finney, who had been quiet throughout the ceremony, finally spoke. "He was a brave man," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That engineer, to be thinking of others, of the design flaw, in a moment like that, he deserved to be remembered." Maggie reached out and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "He is now," she said softly, "because of you." A single tear rolled down Albert's cheek, but this time it was not a tear of guilt or sorrow. It was a tear of release. The burden he had carried for a lifetime was finally gone. As they stood there, the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Maggie thought about the journey that had started in the dusty, quiet attic. It had been a search for a ghost, a name erased from a file, but it had become so much more. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, the quiet resilience of hope, and the undeniable force of a single, simple truth. The truth, she now knew, was not just a collection of facts. It was a living thing. It could be buried, denied, and silenced, but it could not be destroyed. It would wait, patiently, sometimes for generations, for someone to come looking for it. In the end, her quest had not been about rewriting history, but about restoring it. It was about freeing a story that had been trapped in silence, freeing the generations of her family who had been haunted by it, and freeing the soul of a good man who had been lost in the deep. The closing image was not one of tragedy, but of peace. The waves, which had once held a terrible secret, now held a memory, a story that was finally complete. This stretch of ocean was no longer a grave. It was a place of remembrance, a final, peaceful resting place, where the sea and the sky met, and where a promise made in a faded letter had, after a lifetime of waiting, finally been honored.